Today we're going to be looking at how you can set up Firebase admin with Next.js 13, specifically so you can use some Firebase functions in your server components and your API routes. I'm going to show you how to set it up really easily and also some best practices. Let's jump into it. The first step is to have a Firebase project, so I'm going to go over to the Firebase console here and set one up. So on the console, we're going to click Add Project. We're going to enter a project name. I'm going to name it Subscribe. Click Continue. For Google Analytics, enable or disable it based on your needs. Click Create Project. And this is going to spin up a new project here. And once that's done spinning up, you'll see a page like this. You want to create a new web app. Again, give it any name you want. I'm going to call this Subscribe App. Click Register App. And then it's going to take you to the next section saying Add Firebase SDK. We're going to skip this for now as I'm not showing you how to use the Firebase SDK. I'm showing you how to use the Firebase admin one today. So if you click Continue to Console, go over to this settings gear here, click Project Settings, click Service Accounts. Once this loads up, we should see a Generate New Private Key. Now make sure you've got Node.js selected and click Generate New Private Key, Generate Key. And this is going to go ahead and download a JSON file which contains some configuration values we'll use later. While we're in the Firebase console, this will be a good time to set up the database if you haven't already. To do that, all you're going to need to do is come over to here, click Build, Firestore Database. It will have a button that says Create Database. I've already created mine, but it's going to ask you two things. It's going to ask you whether you want to be in production mode or test mode. If you're going to exclusively use the Firebase Admin SDK, I recommend launching in production mode. This just adds a rule so that no one else can access the database unless they're on the Admin SDK. If you're going to be using the other Firebase SDK for some more client-side user authentication stuff, I recommend leaving it as is now and tackling that when you get to that hurdle. So in here, in my Firestore database, I have a collection called images that I've set up. I then have a document called logo as its doc ID. And then in there, I just have a field called URL with a string for the URL of a logo we're going to use. And then I also have a collection called links. And in here, I have a document where I've automated the document ID. And then in here, I have some fields, description, title, and URL. We're going to be pulling these through to the front end and utilizing them in our server components. The last thing to note in here is if you go down to storage and you had some storage, if I click Get Started here, again, you're going to be asked this production mode and test mode. Again, as I said before, if you're going to be using the front end SDK, you may want to use this. If you're just going to be using the admin SDK, I highly recommend launching in production mode. So we'll create that there and we'll utilize that later as well. Now, over in the code, I've loaded up a Next.js template project. What this was built using Create Next App. So it's just going to be your basic template on a Next.js application using server components and the app router. The first thing we're going to want to do when we're over here is we're going to want to create a .env file to store those secrets that we downloaded earlier. So I've got them loaded up from the downloads file here. Now it's worth noting, as I said before, this file should be secretive. It shouldn't be uploaded to Git, and you're just going to want to store it in the environment variables. If someone got access to this, they would have access to your database because they have the Firebase admin privileges. So the thing we're going to want to copy from here is go into our .env, and there's going to be 4 values that we're going to need. I'm going to paste these in here. You can pause to take a look at them. I'm going to also leave a link to a blog in the description below where you can copy and paste these from. So the next public Firebase project ID and next public Firebase storage bucket, these are actually going to be public, so they're going to be available to the front end to use because of this next public bit. But the Firebase private key and the client email, which should remain private, aren't going to be, and these will only be accessed on the server. So to copy those over, if we come into this file, you'll see the project ID here. I'm going to copy this in. And now for storage bucket, mostly the default will be the project ID.appspot.com. If you want to check that or you have a different setup, what you can do is you can come over into the Firebase Admin SDK. And if you click project settings here and scroll down here to the web app we have earlier, you'll actually see the value here. So there we go. It's going to be that project ID plus appspot.com. So if I paste that in here, now next up, we're going to want the private key. This is quite a long value, so you can do Shift Alt right arrow and copy that. And with that copied in, we can go and get the last value, which is going to be that client email. So if I copy in that client email here, paste that into the .env here, and there we go. That's going to be the values we need to connect to the Admin SDK. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. I like to create a folder called DB to store in everything related to Firebase. This just helps keep it organized. And in here, we're going to create firebase-admin.ts as I'm using TypeScript. Now in here, what we're going to want to do, this is where we're going to pull in the Admin SDK. So we're going to do import admin from firebase-admin. This is where you're going to want to install it if you don't already have it installed. So you would do pnpm or npm I and then firebase-admin. Now once that's installed, what we're going to want to do is I'm going to find an interface. You don't have to do this if you're on JavaScript, but if you're on TypeScript, I recommend it. So we're going to import that interface. This is going to be what we need and basically matches our environment variables here. So we have a project ID, client email, storage bucket, and private key. So the next step is we're going to want to create a function to create our Firebase admin app. So if I do export function create Firebase admin app, like so, and this is actually going to take in params. So we're going to use that as an argument. And again, these params are actually going to be what we've defined up here earlier. Now, next up, we're going to want to pull in the private key, but it's worth noting the private key here, you'll see it has these /n's. This is going to be a string at the moment, so we're going to want to convert this into actual new lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a function to format this for us. So that's going to be format private key. And that's just going to take the key as a string. And in here, we're just going to simply return the key, but we're going to do replace, and we're going to type in some regex. Again, you can copy and paste this from a blog post I show, but it's just going to be n/g, and then it's going to be replaced with this. So as I said, all that's doing is that is replacing any of those /n's with a new line. So once we've got that, we can go ahead and define the private key here as private key is going to equal format private key, and then we're going to get that from our params. So params.private key. The next line we're going to do is it's basically going to check that when we run this admin app function that there isn't one already existing, as we don't need to go through that creation process again. So what you're going to do is you're going to do if, and then you're going to do admin.apps.length. If that is greater than 0, then all you're going to need to do is return admin.app. So as I said, this is just going to return the current application if it was already initialized. If it wasn't, we're going to go on to configure it. Next, we're going to need a cert value for our credentials. So what we're going to do is we're going to do const cert, and we're going to use a Firebase function here called admin.credential.cert. And this is going to take in an object. Now, this object we're going to use here, this is literally just going to be the project ID, client email, and the private key. So we're going to come in here, do project ID. That's going to be our params.project ID. Then client email, it's going to be client email. Again, that's going to be pulled in from params.client email. And then for the private key, we can shorthand this as we've defined this up here because we added this format private key function earlier. So we're going to use that value there. Now, lastly, all you're going to want to do is return admin.initializeApp. So this is the bit that's going to actually initialize it. And you're going to do credential. That's going to take an object. So you're going to put in that cert value that we defined earlier. Then you're going to have a project ID. This is going to be from the params again. So params.project ID. And then lastly, we're going to do the storage bucket if you needed one. So that's from params.storage bucket. And there we go. That is the create Firebase admin app. Next thing we're going to create is a way to initialize this. So to create our initialize function here, what I'm going to do is export async function init admin. And inside of here, we're going to need an object called params. And this is going to be the object that pulls in those values that we defined up here, but it's going to pull them in from the environment variables. So the first line we're going to need is going to be project ID. and that's going to be process.env.next_public _firebase _project_id. Now I'm actually going to paste in the values we have earlier, but essentially all you're going to do is process.env and then just go and copy and paste this key that we have over here so we can pull through those environment variables. Next thing I'm going to do, since I'm on TypeScript, I'm going to make sure these are strings because otherwise they'll be string or undefined and the function will moan at us. If you're on JavaScript, you won't have to do this. And if you're on TypeScript and want a better way to do this, I recommend checking out Create T3 Apps env module. It adds some type safety to environment variables. But for now, I'm going to do it this way. So the last thing we're going to do is in this function, we're going to return an instance of the function we called earlier. And I'm going to pass in params there. So we're ready to start using the Admin SDK once we utilize this function. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So what we do in here is in DB, I'm just going to create a new one called firebase.ts. Now this is a good time to actually point out an important package called server only. Now you don't have to use this, but what this does is adds a build time check to make sure that the functions within the folder that uses this, or file, sorry, that uses this, is being called on the server only. So it will just warn you if it was called in a client component, for example. It adds no sort of bundle size, but all you have to do is just do import server only. And I'm actually going to put that in the firebase-admin over here as well, just to make sure that's not being called on the client side. Again, it's just a build time check. It will throw an error at you at build time. So once we're in here, what we're going to want to do, I'm going to want to define a function to get my links. So this is going to come from the Firebase database here. I have a collection called links. I have 2 documents in there, and I have description, title, and URL. So in here, I'm going to do export const get links. This is going to be equal to an async function. And in this function, the first line is going to be const firestore. And it's going to be equal to get firestore. And that's going to be coming from this firebase-admin firestore import here. Next up, what we're going to want to do is we're going to create a link snapshot. So it's going to be const link snapshot. This is going to be equal to, and then we're going to await this. It's going to be firestore.collection, and then the collection name, and then it's going to be .get. The next line after this, I'm going to convert this into some documents. So this is going to be documents. I'm going to do link snapshot .docs. So all of the documents within that link collection that we've got here, I'm going to map them. So what we're going to have here is we're going to have a link, and I'm just going to map them straight to return an object. So I'm going to put it in brackets here, and that's going to be URL, and you're going to do link.data. So that pulls through the data from that document, and then the value we're looking for. So URL for my case, then I'm going to have a title, so link.data.title, and then I'm going to have a description as well. So that's going to be link.data.description. And lastly, I'm going to want to return those documents there so we can use them. So as you'll see here, we now have a list from this function, and it's going to be with the URL, title, and description pulled through from the Firebase Admin SDK. Now you will have to init the admin bit that we set up earlier before you run this function. I'll go ahead and show you how to do that in a server component once we've got the function completed for pulling in the logo URL. So this is going to be how you're going to target a specific document. So to target our specific document here, what we're going to do is we're going to export a const. This is going to be called get logo. Again, this is just going to be an async function. And in here, we're going to need that const firestore bit again. So that's going to be equal to that get firestore that we used earlier. And then the next bit of this is we're going to need that link snapshot again, or logo snapshot in this case. So what I'm going to do is const logo snapshot, and that's going to be equal to await firestore.collection, and this was stored in an images collection for me. And then on top of here, we're going to get the doc called logo. And then lastly, we're going to make sure we get that. The next line I'm going to do is going to be to get the data from the logo. So const logo data. And this is going to equal the logo snapshot dot data. Now using TypeScript, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this is just a type, which is going to be URL string or undefined, as this is important to note. logo snapshot.data will be undefined if it can't find anything there. And on this next line, we're going to handle that. So what we're going to do is, firstly, we're going to check if logo snapshot.exists. So this is just Firebase way of saying true if the document exists. Or we're going to say if the logo data is undefined. So what you want to do is make sure you're using that there so that you're falsifying it. So if the logo snapshot doesn't exist or there's no logo data, we are going to simply return null in this function. You may want to throw an error or do a console log or something like that. And then after that, we can just go ahead and finally return our logo data.url. Now we've got two functions to pull something in from Firebase. So let's go ahead and use them now in a server component. So I'm going to go to the page.tsx here. Now what we're going to want to do is make sure this is an async function. So it can be used as a server component and we can await stuff. And the first line you're going to want to do here is await init admin. As I said earlier, this is how you can start to use that get Firebase that we have here, or get Firestore. So every time get Firestore is called, it's going to want to have an instance of the application already up and running. So that's what this init admin does, is it makes sure that when get Firestore is called, there is an application set up. Next, we're just going to do links, and that's going to equal await get links, and that's going to be imported from our file and function we created earlier. And finally, logo is going to equal await and then get logo. As this is a server component, it doesn't matter where these are. This will be called on the server, not on the client side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here. I'm going to change the source of this image here. I'm going to change this to be logo. Unless logo is null, it can go back to that vercel.svg. And I'm going to change what we had down here for all of the links. So I'm going to get rid of 3 of these here. So all the way up to here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a map of links so that we can have a link per link that we've pulled in. So if I do links, make sure if that's undefined, it's not doing anything. And we call map, and then I'm going to do link. And then I'm just going to go straight into an object here, or straight into the JSX. Put this at the end here. Going to want to make sure there's a key on this. I'm just going to put the key equal to the title for now. As I said, this isn't really a React tutorial, but I'm just doing this quickly to show you how we've sort of pulled in those links there. And I'm going to go ahead and change this href here to just the link.url. And then I'm going to change this docs here to the link.title. And finally, this text down here to link.description. Now we go ahead and save that. I'm going to spin up the dev server here, pm run dev. And hopefully we should see all of those values pulled through from Firestore. And there we have it. In our front end here, we have the image pulled in via that URL in our database, and we have the 2 links pulled in from our database. Next up, I'm going to show you how you can pull in this image from storage. I'm also going to show you how you can obfuscate the download URL if you're using the get download URL function, because this has an access token that, again, is hard to guess and it's already pretty secure, but it does mean anyone with that access token could access the image. I'll explain a bit more about this later and how we could use an API route to add a further layer of abstraction to this so no one can even see the access token. So firstly, what we're going to want to do is in our storage, we're going to want to add an image. So I've added logo.png here. Now, if you set this up, you'll be asked the same questions, so production or test mode. I put this in production mode as, again, I'm only using the Admin SDK. So it's just going to have that rule, allow read write if false, so no one else can access this unless, again, as I said, for the public download URLs, even if you have a rule like that and they have the access token, they will be able to access the image. You can come in here and click create new access token, which would make that one expire, or you could click revoke to get rid of it. But again, every time you ask for the public download URL, it is worth noting that it will go back here and you'll have to revoke it again. So over in our firebase.ts, I'm going to create a new function. This is going to be export const get logo from storage. And this is going to be equal to an async function. And what we're going to want here is something new, which is going to be a bucket. So I'm going to do const bucket. This is going to equal get storage. So that's going to be a function from firebase-admin /storage. And then we're going to do .bucket and call that function there. Next, we're going to want to make sure we have a file. So const file is going to be equal to bucket.file, and that's going to be the path for where it is on your Firebase storage. So for me, it was just at the root level, logo.png. If you had a folder or something, it would be completed/logo.png. So now we've got this, we're going to get the public download URL. So I'm going to do const image URL, and this is going to equal to an await, and we're going to do get download URL, and that's going to be an import from Firebase admin storage here. And then we're going to put this in brackets, and we're going to pass this the file that we have referenced here. And lastly, I'm going to return the image URL. So if we go over into our page.tsx, I'm going to change this get logo call here to get logo from storage. Save that, and if we go over into our Next.js application, we should see the logo looks the same, but that will be now pulled in via our Admin SDK via the storage. Now, it's worth noting you may have run into an error about something to do with your hosts. If you're running into something with remote patterns, it's going to look a little something like this so that you can actually host images from Firebase storage, googleapis.com. So the next thing we're going to look at is how you can obfuscate that download URL, as I said, because what we're going to go ahead and do here is if I come under here and I do console.log image URL, save that, and click this link here, you'll see that I have access to this just from anywhere. And this is because of this token here. As I said, that matches this token down here. If I go ahead and just type anything there, I'll get permission denied. So I do need the access token to access it. But if you want to hide this from your users, you can add another layer using an API route. So we're going to check that out now. So over in our app folder here, we're going to want to create a new folder called API for our API route. And then also that under that, we're going to want to create our root. So I'm going to just call it /API/image. In here, we're going to want to create the root.ts folder. And then finally in here, we're going to want to export an async function. And this is going to be the get request that we need. So if I do export async function get, and this is just going to be request. And then in TypeScript, we're going to have a request type there. And then inside here, we're going to want to make sure we're in it admin again. This is to make sure when we're running the functions, as I said, that the admin has been initialized. And then in here, we're going to do const image URL, and we can actually pull through that function that we had earlier. So that's going to be get logo from storage. So this is now pulling through that URL that we had earlier, but this is server side, so no one on the front end will see it. And what we can do with this is we can actually just pass through a fetch request. So if I do response, it's going to equal await fetch, and that's going to be the image URL. What we can then do is return a new response, and that's just going to be with response.body, and response.headers is what I'm going to use here. This is going to have to be in a object here, and then we're going to put headers, response.headers. So basically what this is doing, it's just passing through that fetch request so that it's done on the server side first, and then we pass it through to the front end. As I said, this will hide the URL with the access token, and the URL will now be API/image. So I'll go ahead and show you that here. See my page.tsx, I've already changed the logo to just be a static root of API/image. And if we go into our application, you can see the logo is there and being pulled through. And if I go to /API/image, the image is being pulled through correctly. There's no access token. It's completely hidden now on the server side. So that is everything that I had to show you today. If you have any more questions about Firebase, do consult the links down below in the description. I'll leave some to some documentation and also a blog post that explains a bit more of this. Again, if you have any more comments, feel free to reach out on Twitter or leave a comment in the description below. Thanks for watching.